Well, three of us are here in Dunedin and in the middle of a howling gale. Lisa is Palmerston North, Anne and I are in Carey's Bay, Michael's across the harbour, and it's kind of appropriate as a howling gale rages around us that on this 12th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Te Ratapu Te Kama Rua o Hewa Noa, we've got the stilling of the storm, and Lisa has some background.
Thank you, Michael. So I think this story in a way is, we could almost call it an unassuming little passage. I mean, a big miracle, right? But sandwiched between two much bigger stories early in Mark's Gospel, not long after the calling of the 12. So on one side of this passage is a description of Jesus teaching crowds so large that he has to stand on a boat to address them. And, you know, we have all these big familiar parables about the kingdom of heaven, all drawn on domestic or farming scenes. And on the other side of this story is that we read today are the descriptions of big healing events. In particular, a really lengthy story about the restoration of the demon-possessed man, the woman with the hemorrhage, and the raising of Jairus's daughter. And so this is a scene in between those big events. And so in narrative terms, in many ways, it's a passage or a transition scene, something that describes how Jesus went from one location to another. But it's also, I think, much, much more than that. This scene is a transition, not just in terms of going from one place to another, or from day to night, or from storm to calm, but it's a transition in the disciples' thinking. When they set out from the shore, they thought they had a teacher in the boat with them. But when they came ashore, they were beginning to see him, if only dimly, as something else.
I love that notion of transition. Thank you. That's a lovely kind of lens to look through. All right, well, let's start where it's challenging, but that's a lovely background. Michael, can you tell me where you find this challenging?
Oh, well, I think this idea, or seeing and hearing about Jesus being asleep in the boat and the disciples being overwhelmed with fear, and finally they wake Jesus up and he calms the storm. The challenge for me is to, well, in my walk with Christ, is to be trusting, to understand that Jesus is ever present and that everything is under control. But to believe that and to hold on to that in the reality of day-to-day life is a difficult thing to do. So that's the challenge for me.
Yeah, absolutely it is, isn't it? And don't we know it in the world we live in at the moment? Anne, challenge.
Last Friday, when I was with a little group looking at the Psalms, one woman there expressed how challenging she found the idea of fearing God. And of course, here we've got the disciples fearing Jesus. And for her, it was because when we talk about being afraid of something or someone, it's because we're dreading it or because it's something destructive or evil. So to me, one challenge is to try to get my head around what sort of fear this is. You know, they've got one sort of fear of the storm. It's a different word. The word that they use for having fear of Jesus is in the Gospels far more awe and reverence and kind of almost being overwhelmed. So that's kind of half the challenge. And the other challenge for me, or the half of that, is that Dorothy Sayers said that classic thing about that we tend to domesticate God. We tend to pare the claws of the Lion of Judah and make him fit for a household pet. And perhaps we do that because the reality of who Jesus is scary in that sense of overwhelming goodness, but still overwhelming.
Yes, indeed. And C.S. Lewis, Aslan is not a tame lion.
Yeah, I thought
Lisa, for you, yeah, I bet you did. Lisa, for you, the challenge here.
Well, my challenge was very similar, I guess, which was this whole idea that it wasn't the storm that terrified them, it was the calm. And the realization that, you know, it's quite reasonable in the presence of God to feel awe and fear and maybe even confusion, because our perceptions are disrupted. We, as you say, we try to confine God. We find metaphors for God, and they always fall short. But the disciples here encountered the real thing, and this kind of the preconceptions they had put over their eyes about who Jesus was, he was a teacher, were falling, and they were seeing something new. And that happens, I think, with us as we proceed in our Christian lives, is that our vision of God changes and inspires this awe and wonder, or at least it should. It should blow our minds.
And it's kind of daunting when we seek to be ambassadors of Christ, and yet we know how we're kind of just overawed, and our sense of inadequacy can be quite crippling at times. I guess that's why we have a Spirit of God to help us. So let's move to some good news there, and ask you first of all, Michael, where you look for good news.
Well, just in the fact that Jesus responded to their overwhelming fear.
Yeah.
That's the good news for me. He actually did respond. He was lying in the back of the boat. He must have been absolutely exhausted, the poor chap, but he was at peace. He was confident. So they wake him up and he responds. He calms the storm. All is well, But of course, another kind of fear would have set in, as we discussed. Anyway.
Well, yeah, it's such a powerful image. This. Okay, I get it. You guys are frightened, and it appears over and again in his dealing with people in torment. So that's really helpful to hang on to as we converse through this passage. For you, Lisa, for you, some good news.
I guess the obvious thing is that the good news of this passage has to be that if your picture of Jesus is too small, or if your view of yourself is too small, or if the storm feels too big or too overwhelming, or if it's been going on for much too long, then this passage reminds us that the person in the boat with us is the King of Israel, the creator of all, the Lord of all, the master of the storm. And so we are not the victims of mighty forces. We are the loved companions of an unchanging, all-powerful, mighty God. What could be better than that?
And I do find that deeply comforting, both in terms of the storms that beset us emotionally and even physically, and the political storms that we live in at the moment. And then every now and again, just sitting back and saying, he's been here before, he'll be here again, and he's brought his people through. And where do you excavate good news?
Well, my good news does kind of flow directly from the challenge. When I was reading it, I just got this image of wandering through the bush in Australia, picking up sticks, and then picking up one stick which wriggled in my hand. and just, yeah, it's okay. I mean, that in itself is not good news, in that who really wants to pick up a snake? But the contrast between the everyday picking up a stick, and suddenly something being alive. And to me, that's what happened. Lisa, you talked about it so beautifully in the background as well, that the disciples had understood God as this much, and suddenly, wham, as if they'd picked up something living. And to me, the good news is that that's the God we're talking about. I think Jesus is revealed as shockingly alive, filled with divine life, and that he still is. We're not playing a game. We're not dabbling in some nice practices which are good for our well-being. God's alive and active with us. And that might be overwhelming good news, but I still think it's good news.
Okay, so let's stop being ethereal and let's be applied. Michael, so what?
Well, I really enjoyed the beginning and that idea Lisa brought of transition. So I think the so what for me is the disciples underestimated Jesus. And that's something that we can all really, really do. Let our perception be limited. And if anything out of this passage, for me, the take home would be to understand that we ought to be more confident in our faith. And therefore we can stand a little bit taller, knowing that Jesus is indeed with us. We can depend on Christ, no matter what. Yeah.
Lovely sense through all the storms.
Yeah.
Through all the storms, he's there. That tends to be the experience when we look back on our lives. Let's ask you, Lisa, where you find so what?
So I'm going to pick up an obscure little phrase in verse 36. It says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was. And I really paused over that, just as he was. I mean, I guess at one level it means he didn't put his wet weather gear on. But it reminds us that in the big arcs of this gospel, Jesus does not change. From the teachings on the shore to the storm on the boat to the big healing miracles, Jesus is the same. What is happening is all of one piece. So he is unchanging, but everyone and everything around him is changing because of his presence. And our view of who he is constantly changing. So if I were preaching on this passage, I'd ask the question, where are you in the story? Are you on the bank that he's left and, listening to those miracles? Are you in one of the other boats, aware of the storm and the calm, but don't know what's happening? Are you in the boat with Jesus? Are you on the other shore waiting for a miracle? And I'd ask you, what is God saying to you from that position?
That's lovely, and that's very much that sense that I think Mark asks of us, put ourselves in this story. So thank you. And also, I'm vaguely reminded that I think you introduced me, Lisa, many years ago to the notion of Christ as the still point of the turning world. And it seems that you're drawing on that a little there too. And give me a final so what.
Okay, well, coming in from a slightly different angle, this story, as Lisa said, comes just before that amazing story of the healing of the demoniac. And so you see Jesus stilling the chaos of the waters as God did at creation, and then stilling the chaos of this man's mind. And what it made me think of was the number of people that we may feel scared of in the negative sense of fear, because they're unpredictable, because there seems to be chaos in their minds. So, people who are suffering from some severe mental illness, or prisoners, or for some people, teenagers. That might be why a lot of folk are reluctant to teach secondary school. And that in turn made me think of Father Gregory Boyle, who I pointed out to people a few weeks ago, who of course works all the time with gangsters, working daily with people whose inner and outer worlds are chaotic, unexpected, and therefore dangerous. But he lives with the conviction that Jesus can still their chaos, and that the power of God is strong enough even for that. So my so what is to notice that if I find myself thinking that someone is beyond God, or that they wouldn't respond to the gospel, just to remember that Jesus can still the storm. And it can still reach them, can still bring order out of chaos.
Finding a glorious presence of Christ in the midst of turmoil. It's a lovely passage, very vivid, and I think we've all managed to extrapolate something quite heartwarming in these times. Lisa, Michael, Anne, thank you very much for breaking this powerful passage open.